Hey YouTube, Poopslag here, and this is TurboFat, an open source game I'm making in the Godot engine. You can find a link to the source code at the GitHub page in the description below. And this month I've been adding this indoor area you can see, a couple new monsters and some expanded conversation logic for talking to them, as well as a couple other little extras which I'll get into in a moment. So let me show you what I've been doing. So the first thing you might notice is you're not alone on the overworld anymore. You have this little purple friend who follows you around. And as you run away, he'll chase after you. And then if you sort of chase after him or try to bump into him, he'll try to give you some space so you can get by. The way I implemented that is there is this instructor creature on the overworld now, and he has a move timer attached to him. And that move timer kicks off every fraction of a second. And the event that timer kicks off is it calculates the player's position relative to the monster. And if the player gets too far, then the monster will run towards you. And if the player gets too close, then the monster reverses that direction and runs away. So I made the chat system a little more complex. I wanted to avoid the case where you'd talk to some people on the overworld, and then they'd suddenly suck you into a big conversation or a puzzle you didn't want to do. So now they have a different speech bubble, like this cookie speech bubble shows you this person's going to make you play a puzzle. This exclamation speech bubble you see down here tells you this guy's he's got a lot to say, you know, maybe some story dialogue or something like that. Where these tiny speech bubbles are for throwaway conversations like, I like ice cream or whatever. This also gets rid of the thing where you would talk to someone and then say if you wanted to pick a puzzle or not. Now if you talk to someone with a puzzle icon, you're always playing a puzzle. It's just a little smoother that way. I also created this indoor overworld scene, which is pretty much the same as the regular overworld scene with a few minor differences, such as assets, support for things like these guys sitting in chairs. And also it uses a horizontal isometric grid instead of a diagonal isometric grid. I did this for two reasons. Firstly, so I could reuse the restaurant assets I'd already drawn. But also I wanted to have the idea of the chef chucking in food from a distance and swooshing in horizontally. And that really wouldn't work if the assets were diagonal, where the food would be chucked in from the northeast or the northwest or whatever. So horizontal was the way to go. Right now I'm copying and pasting a lot of these components from the overworld scene, especially for the UI. So I'm hoping I can refactor these to be reusable components in the coming week. So before I decided how the restaurant would look on the overworld, I drew about 10 different mock-ups. A couple were based on fast food restaurants I was familiar with. A couple were based on fast food restaurants from TV shows. And then I evolved that into trying to think of some designs that might use the block shapes from the game, or even if the buildings started to look like monsters themselves, which got a little crazy, and I decided against that route. But I eventually iterated onto a design that I enjoyed, and drew it, and added it to the game. But this caused an immediate problem, because for the overworld, everything was currently isometric, so I drew the restaurant isometric as well. And the problem with that approach is which order do you draw the things on the overworld? Usually you use something called Y ordering, where the objects that are furthest back are drawn first. And you determine that by looking at their Y coordinate. So the Y coordinate of this restaurant might be here, somewhere in the middle. Someone who's in front of this restaurant might appear here, and someone who's in back of this restaurant might appear over here, and we want them to be partially hidden. We have a problem, because Y ordering doesn't work for this. The restaurant's Y coordinate is here and might have a Y coordinate of 70, but this person, despite being in front of the restaurant, actually has a higher Y coordinate of maybe something like 60. And this guy's supposed to be behind the restaurant, but his Y coordinate is greater, maybe something like 80. This would work okay if the restaurant were square, where the left and right corners of it were the same height. But because I'd gone with the design where this restaurant was rectangular, making it diagonally isometric just totally broke Y ordering. It was irreconcilable, and the only fix would be to do something like break up the restaurant into multiple assets, which I was willing to do, but I'd have to do this for every single asset in the game. It seemed completely insane when there was just a much easier fix. And the fix was just to redraw the restaurant as a forward-facing asset. That way, if the restaurant's Y coordinate is 70 here, anybody in front of it will have a higher Y coordinate, and anybody behind it will have a lower Y coordinate. Much simpler. I also needed a way for you to walk into the restaurant. And again, I played with a few different designs, like having a big arrow, a couple of small arrows, or one little arrow. But I eventually decided triangles communicated just as much as arrows. And then if somehow the triangles were still ambiguous, I thought animating them would really hit it home for anybody who couldn't understand what they meant. But I mean, come on, it's a puzzle game. If floor triangles are too confusing for you, it's probably not the game for you anyways. And yeah, the result looks pretty good. Here you can see the restaurant and the triangles, and then when you step on them, they take you inside. there's a little bit of logic dictating what it means to step on the arrow. I added a collision shape that's actually only on the front of the arrow. Stepping on the back of the arrow doesn't matter. And then a script which says, when the player steps on that collision shape, we set this flag, and then as long as that flag stays set, we check the direction the player's moving, and if they're moving towards the exit, we fade out and change the scene. So this means it's okay for the player to step on the arrow as long as they're not moving up towards the exit. This is especially important because these arrows often double as spawn points, and we don't want the player to pop out and then immediately pop back in the exit. But it also helps just to alleviate frustration where they're walking sideways past a building and they get sucked into the entrance. The fade in, fade out effect is handled with this scene transition autoload singleton, which has signals letting the scenes know when they should fade in and fade out. And then as you might expect, the overworld just has this giant rectangle which covers everything, and we change its opacity to fade things in and out. So frankly, all the stuff I'd been doing for this month, creating the whole overworld environment, doing all this shader stuff, copying it to work indoors as well, rewriting the conversation logic, all this stuff was kind of a drag and not very fun to code. So to give myself a break, I decided to work on some new desserts. Instead of just the regular cheesecake from before, there's now chocolate cake, strawberry cake, a couple brownies and snacks and pies, and each of them has a different cake box graphic as well. Instead of reusing the generic rainbow-colored cake box, now there's 8 different cakes depending on which kind of cake you're making. And unfortunately, this sort of made the rainbow frosting obsolete, because it didn't make sense to have a brown and white box explode with rainbow frosting. So to keep that feeling consistent, I changed the monochromatic frosting to be rainbow-colored on cake boxes. So for example, mixing a white, brown, and pink piece makes this white, brown, and pink striped cake, whereas mixing 2 bread pieces and a chocolate piece makes a bready chocolate-looking cake. And then when you clear lines in those 2 blocks, you can see there's those doughy brownies on the left and the familiar cakes on the right. There's only 8 ways to make cake blocks, and each of the 8 results in a new kind of food. We've also got the final 2 songs in the soundtrack, courtesy of Pete Elson of Disco Warp Records, one called Chocolate Chipster, and lastly, Gingerbread House. Well, he held up his end. Now it's on me to finish the game. Wish me luck. So yeah, my original plan for this month was to have the story and cutscenes in place, but unfortunately, before you can have a story and cutscenes, you do have to have a place where all that stuff can happen, like scenes and settings and stuff, which took way longer than I thought it was going to take. I thought I had all the assets and stuff and just had to rearrange them, but I had to make this whole isometric area and the transitions between them. It was a mess, but I think now that that stuff's out of the way, we're go for story and cutscenes, so I really want to get that done next month, and I hope to see you guys then. Thanks for watching. See you later.